is with the administration helping us make this happen, and so incredibly grateful to have the administration here. We have Lisa O'Brien with the Bureau of Chief Administration and Technology, Superintendent Felipe Colon, Bureau Chief Investigative Services, Sergeant Detective Eric Bowman, who's with Special Investigations Unit, and Maurice Joyce, the City Auditor. And in terms of panel 2, we have advocates Fatima Ahmad, who's the Executive Director of the Muslim Justice League, Cade Crawford, who is the Director of Technology for Liberty Programs at ACLUM. And I will turn it over to my colleagues for brief opening remarks, starting with my co-sponsor, Councilor Arroyo. Councilor Arroyo, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Civil forfeiture funds and how they are used is incredibly important to the city, and why they are used in the way they are is incredibly important to understanding the decisions made by not just BPD, but the city of Boston when we make these kinds of appropriations. And so I look forward to a hearing discussing what decisions are made, why those decisions are made, and how we go about getting from point A to point B. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Arroyo. And I believe we have next in order of arrival is Councilor Bach. You now have the floor.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you to you and Councilor Arroyo for filing this. I share a lot of concern about civil asset forfeiture, period. I think that most Americans assume that if assets are going to be seized, it's going to be in relation to a due judicial process. And the fact that that's not the case, I think, is a little known thing among the public, but can really have some very difficult impacts on people. But also, I think it leads to these types of transparency challenges where the council, even though we have whole budget hearings about revolving funds that include very small amounts of money, somehow the way that this money is coming in and being spent is not coming through us. And I think that's certainly not how the charter of the city is designed to operate. People have said before that it is crazy that if you spend $1,000, it has to come through the city council. But I think that that really does ensure transparency, and the fact that these funds are skipping us altogether is deeply concerning. So I appreciate you using your chair and committee, Madam Chair, to really draw our attention to this and figure out how we can change procedures going forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Bach. I believe we also have Councilor Michael Flaherty, who's at large.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for hosting and sponsoring the hearing, and thank you for our police department for attending. I look forward to the discussion, learning more about this issue, obviously the technology and any value that it will bring our city in helping address concerns and questions about privacy and surveillance. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we keep our residents and our visitors safe at all times. And look forward to hearing about the asset forfeiture as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Flaherty. I believe we also have Councilor Ruthie Louis-Jean at large.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you to sponsors for bringing this issue forward, to Councilors Arroyo and Mayor Wu, then Councilor Wu for filing the surveillance oversight ordinance, and to all the investigative journalism that brought this to light, because before that, we just had no idea that this was happening. The responsibility of the city council is to exercise its oversight powers. And as a new councilor myself, it's important that I better understand how procurement works and how it's historically worked and how it's going to work with the full implementation of the surveillance oversight ordinance that was passed last year. We obviously need more insight and oversight on how civil forfeiture dollars are used, especially for the purchase of items that may serve as an invasive affront to our privacy rights. And we also know that civil forfeiture is often abused and serves to disadvantage those who can't fight back, often innocent folks. So here to listen and to learn. Thanks BPD for being here, and I look forward to this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Louis-Jean. I would would like to take a quick moment to offer some opening remarks of my own. This is the first hearing on the Committee of Government Accountability, Transparency, and Accessibility. And in light of this occasion, I just want to take a quick minute to just tell you a little bit about what those values mean to us as a body in light of this hearing order in particular. So let's talk about transparency first. When we talk about transparency, it means fighting for the right to keep the public informed and engaged on all matters related to their tax dollars and their city government. When it comes to accountability, it's a reminder that we work for the people and not the other way around. And when it comes to accessibility, it means that the work of our city should not be conducted behind closed doors or without the approval of the voices of the people. I found out when I found out that the Boston Police Department was spending civil asset dollars on surveillance equipment through the news, this was entirely unacceptable. We're here today because the public is in need of answers to burning questions about the state of surveillance oversight in our city. For those who do not know, it was brought to our attention that several Boston city councilors in December of 2021, that the Boston Police Department spent over $600,000 on a cell site stimulator, a piece of surveillance technology that allows the police to secretly obtain location, other potential identifying information from a person's cell phone. The council had never been briefed or notified of this purchase. The idea of a city government purchasing surveillance equipment using hidden pots of money is exactly why our body passed the surveillance oversight ordinance last year. This era of secrecy has to end. And I would like to thank my co-sponsor, Councilor Arroyo, for his work in this space, and for all of my colleagues for their attendance here today. I hope that we can walk away with some great knowledge and action items, more importantly, for increasing accountability, transparency, and accessibility moving forward. And I think it's really important to recognize that our job as the City Council is to be the fiscal financial stewards of this conversation. So we hope that as the administration moves through this conversation, recognizing that we have an obligation and an opportunity to really bring our those who are tuning in into the conversation and to help educate them in terms of how we got here. So thank you so very much for being here today. It means a lot to us. I will now turn over the conversation to our panel. We'll start by hearing presentations from the administration, followed by questions from our counselors, and then we'll hear testimony from our second panel, followed by questions. And we will close out with public testimony. I will start with the chief, with Chief Lisa O'Brien, then go to Superintendent Philippe Colon, then Sergeant Detective Eric Pullman, and finally Maureen Joyce, the city auditor. So now you know the order in which you're gonna appear on camera, so just get yourselves ready. Chief Lisa O'Brien, you now have the floor.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Thank you for having us here. We are delighted basically to explain the procurement of this good, and also to where the funds actually came from. I'm open for any questions around the procurement, any questions with respect to the equitable share and trust fund that we have, which is a fund that we have as a result of a federal law, the actual Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, which is how this trust, asset forfeiture trust, started and was actually signed between the federal government and the Boston Police Department back in 1994. So I'm open for questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Superintendent Colon.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning. I'm Superintendent Felipe Colon, Commander of the Bureau of Investigative Services at the Boston Police Department. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify at this hearing today to discuss docket number 0200 and to address several misconceptions about this particular piece of surveillance equipment and its procurement. As you already know, I'm joined here by Lisa O'Brien, who's the Commander of the Administration and Technology Bureau, as well as Sergeant Detective Bowman of the Special Investigations Unit. As Lisa just alluded to, she will explain the public procurement process used to obtain the cell site simulator, and then Sergeant Bowman and I will be available to answer any questions on how the equipment is used in service of public safety. The surveillance equipment in question was purchased long before the surveillance ordinance was created. We understand that it's covered under the surveillance ordinance, and as such will be included in the BPD's surveillance policy, which will be reviewed by the City Council later this year. We are providing to the council extensive documentation on the procurement of this technology, as well as a spreadsheet of all the times this technology has been used. I will now yield the floor to my colleague, Sergeant Bowman.
Good morning. Thank you for having us. My name is Sergeant Detective Eric Bowman. My last name is spelled B-U-L-M-A-N. I'm a supervisor within the Special Investigations Unit, which is a multi-agency unit within the Bureau of Investigative Services. We conduct investigation on organized crime and violent criminal organizations. We also conduct investigation as designated by the chief, bureau chief, of having unique or special circumstances. We assist the districts and other specialized units with their criminal investigations, with personnel and technical resources. And we also coordinate investigations with local, state, and federal partners. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll move over now to the auditor.
Morning, folks. Maureen Joyce, the city auditor. Thank you for the invitation to this meeting, and I look forward to understanding the issue and see how I and my office can help move this forward.
Great. Thank you for that. I am now going to note, thank you to our panel, and I would also like to note that my co-chair, Councillor Edwards of District 1, has joined us, and would like to give her an opportunity to make opening remarks.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I apologize for background noise. But I will just simply say I'm excited about this conversation. I think it's a necessary practice in accountability. Thank you so much for filing this ordinance. I wanted to make sure that not only is this a practice in accountability and conversation, but that we also understand thoroughly how the ordinance is going to work. And I appreciate the BPD admitting, or at least acknowledging, that this would have been under the ordinance had it been filed and passed before they had procured this particular equipment. So thank you. I'm excited for this conversation. And thank you again, Councilor Mejia.
Thank you, Councillor Edwards. I'm going to open up on the floor to my colleagues to ask their questions, starting with my co-sponsor, Councillor Arroyo.
Thank you. If you can give me, if you can come back to me in the next one, not just one person. I'm trying to handle something real quick.
Okay, no worries. No worries. I'm going to move on to Councillor Bach, District 8. You now have the floor.
Thank you so much. I wondered, Madam Chair, if the department could walk us through a bit how civil asset forfeiture funds like flow as a standard procedure. So, you know, how they come in, how, like, are they sort of certified as like, yes, we're holding on to this, and then who kind of makes the decision about how those are appropriated?
So
yes, that actually is the purpose of accessibility for these hearings. So I think that's a really great question to ask and have folks walk us through, because this is what we're trying to do, is make government accessible to the people. And if people don't understand the language and don't understand what it is that we're talking about, it's going to be null and void. So thank you so very much, Councillor Bach, for leading with that. So let's do it.
So I appreciate the question regarding the civil asset forfeiture. While we, the BPD, receive a portion of the assets that are forfeited, those cases are handled and controlled by the prosecutors.
So, and sorry, I can't quite tell because you guys are all on the screen. Who was talking? Was that the superintendent?
That is correct, ma'am. Superintendent Felipe Colon.
Great, thank you, Superintendent. So, Superintendent, I understand that so what you're saying is that the ADA in the case or whatever is going to decide whether these funds are being kind of certified and coming to you. Is that right?
That is correct. We initiate the seizure through the investigation, but then it's handled by the prosecutors. It could be the ADA, the AUSA, or even the Attorney General's office.
And are those funds in the meantime, like whatever it is that you've seized, are they held by BPD? The no. Literal whatever you've seized?
No, they're not, and I will yield it to
No, they're not held by BPD. However, when the portion of Our portion comes in after it's been determined, like how much is going to be shared equitably. It's held in a trust that's managed, or that the custodian is the treasurer of the City of Boston Treasury Department. So it comes in through our Treasury Department in a trust fund. And again, I just want to correct myself. This trust agreement was signed between the federal government and the Boston Police back in 1997 and not 1994. But that's that. So we have no control of how they determine how much our share is. It's based on the investigation and the outcome of the investigation. And then depending on how many parties were involved in the investigation based on the trust agreement, it's equitably shared amongst those agencies.
And what's the name of the trust?
The actual trust is the Federal Equitable Sharing Agreement, or Sharing Trust.
Okay, well, so there's the agreement we signed, but then there has to be a trust that's actually.
The trust is actually held in the city's Treasury Department. They're the custodians of the trust.
And you think it's called the Federal Equitable? Sorry, I just want us to be able to look up the trust documents after. So
the trust is the Equitable Sharing Trust Fund, and it was founded based on the Federal Equitable Sharing Agreement that was signed between the Boston Police Department and the federal government back in 1997.
Got it. All right, and I think I'll just say, Madam Chair, for the record, I think that it would be helpful for the council to be provided with the funds, the trust fund documents, both the agreement from 97 and also understand who the trustees of that are. I don't know, Lisa, if you can speak to who the trustees are along with the treasurer.
I don't have it at this time. I know it's in my book. I can share that with you later, though. Counselor.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine, I know with our trust funds, there's always at least 3 trustees. It's quite standard for the collector treasurer to be 1, but I would just like to understand, so then once the funds are in the trust, does the department go to the trust with proposals on how the money should be spent?
So according to the actual fund itself is how we can, so for example, the Equitable Sharing Trust Fund was founded for the purpose of enhancing law enforcement efforts. And so basically there are guidelines in the trust that say what we can and can't spend the money on, or the funds on. I also want to point out that anything that we take out of the trust goes through the Treasury Department, because it's coded to the trust fund that's held by the Treasury, who's the custodian of the fund. But every purchase that is made goes through the appropriate procurement process under Mass General Law. And in this case, we followed Mass General Law Chapter 30B because it was a good. So it started with a requisition that went to Treasury. Treasury approves it to make sure that we're falling within the criteria set forth of what we can and can't purchase. From there, it goes into a purchasing department where, an invitation for bid was entered into the portal. We had specs. We publicly advertised that bid. It was in the Commonwealth Goods and Services Bulletin, and also it was in the city record. We received 4 interested parties that were interested and looked at that proposal, and we had 1 bid. And then it went through the whole process of the procurement process as far as executing a contract, which again, all contract documents get reviewed through Corporation Counsel before the actual contract is executed.
And Lisa, can you just clarify for me, because in the other trusts that I'm familiar with in the city that are sort of similarly constituted, the trustees actually vote on the things that the trust fund is dispersing for. So is that is a meeting of the trustees called to approve that initial request from you all, or do they just disperse a certain amount of money or authorize you guys to a certain amount of money out of this trust, and then you're going through all the procurement steps that you mentioned?
There's no meeting of the trustees, counselors. However, it's based on whatever we purchase from the trust is based on what we are allowed to purchase within the trust guidelines. So for example, it could be anything that we want to purchase, a filing cabinet. It's to enhance our law enforcement efforts. The purpose of the fund obviously was to, receive an equitable share of forfeit assets that basically would reduce crime, because obviously you take an asset, property, real property, money from, white collar crime, drug dealers. And that was the purpose of it, that would enhance our policing efforts, but also too, it can't be supplanted with our operating budget. But these are to like enhance our funds to allow us to purchase goods such as these.
And do you have records that you could provide the committee with of sort of how much money's flowed through that trust fund in the last 5 years and what it's been spent on?
Absolutely. I'd like to point out that we are required by federal law that we have to file an annual report and certification to the federal government every year on the ins and outs of that fund. And that's filed annually in our finance division here at the Boston Police Department. And it's reviewed by our legal advisor as well.
Great. So yeah, I think it would be helpful for the council to have, I think the trust, both the agreement, the actual trust docs to understand the decision procedure there, and then the record of the last 5 years. And I just think that, I think the point that the chair made and others at the start, is that I think, trust funds can often be an effective way of dealing with complicated funds, and we certainly use them all over the city. But I think that the council wants to understand, precisely because of the relationship that it bears to the operating budget and to the operations of the department, a bit more from an oversight perspective. So looking forward to those documents. Thanks, Madam Chair. I think those are my questions for now.
Thank you, Councilor Brock. Great line of questions. Really do appreciate you digging in here this way. I'm just curious, Councilor Arroyo, before I call on you, wanted to just acknowledge that Councilor Lara, District 6 is here, as well as Councilor Tanya Fernandez-Anderson from District 7, and our Council President Ed Flynn, District 2, have also joined us. So I can have them make some opening quick remarks and then kick it over to you, Councilor Arroyo, if that works.
Hey, thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Kenzie Bach, Councilor Bach, for those questions. You covered some of mine, but one of my questions is, why were civil asset forfeiture funds used to purchase this specific equipment?
That question is to the administration, so Lisa or anyone from your team would be able to answer.
Well, so I can tell you that this, and let me just start off by saying that this particular piece of equipment is controlled and secured by the commander of the Special Investigations Unit. There is only limited folks that have access to this technology, this piece of equipment, and who can operate this piece of equipment. Basically, as you'll see from the records that we provided, this technology was deployed, I would say, 106 times in the past 6 years now. 70 was under court order, and 36, I believe, was under exigent circumstances. In many of those instances, this technology saved lives. It averted harm, trauma to the community, and it's also helped us apprehend violent offenders. So the technology was purchased, and I don't think you could put a price on that, but the technology was purchased for those particular reasons, to help the community in public safety, in service to public safety.
So let me be more clear, and I appreciate you going into, it's secured and controlled and how it's used, but I meant specifically, why were civil asset forfeiture funds used to purchase this equipment? Why was the decision made to use civil asset forfeiture funds to purchase this?
Well, it was helped to defray costs or expenditures that weren't included in our operating budget. So this was not an item that was budgeted in our operating budget. For example, I want to say last year we purchased 5 vans through the Equitable Share and Trust that we did not have the available operating funds in our budget. And those vans were used to help police get from one side of the city to another during any kind of protest or public gatherings where they were needed. So it's to enhance our operating budget, to allow us to purchase things that we normally would not be able to include in our operating budget, since the most part of our operating budget is for the maintenance of day-to-day operations.
And so, as a sort of follow-up question to that, is this, to everybody present, is this the only instance of use of civil asset forfeiture funds to purchase surveillance equipment you are aware of? And if it is not, what other surveillance equipment was purchased using civil asset forfeiture funds, and when?
As far as I know, Councillor, this is the only purchase that I've been here that we've used those funds for surveillance equipment. However, as Councilor Bach has requested, I would like the opportunity to review the general ledger going back to the last 5 years to confirm that. But in my time here as the finance director and then the CFO, and now as bureau chief, this was the only time that I was involved in the use of the funds purchasing surveillance equipment.
Thank you for that very clear answer. I appreciate the clarity. And just how long have you been there?
I've been with the Boston Police Department now for 10 years.
Thank you. Appreciate that as well. Thank you for your service. In terms of the oversight, is there any oversight or audit conducted by the city on purchases made with civil asset forfeiture funds?
Well, I think I wouldn't necessarily say an audit, but I can tell you right now that the Treasury is pretty strict with anything that we put through any of these trust funds. However, we are required to file both federally and state all the ins and outs of the fund and funds that we currently have. And I think whoever, the federal government could come in any time and say, we're going to do an audit of those purchases. But that's basically what we're required to do under the federal law here with this forfeiture trust fund. And we have all the funds that we had that show the ins and outs and what we're required to file according to the agreement.
Has the federal government ever done that? Have they ever come in and said, we're going to look over and audit anything?
Not that I'm aware of at my time here. I don't know if they've ever come into Treasury Department because they are the custodian of the actual fund. So I can't answer, but in the time that I've been here, last time the feds were in here was basically to oversee the use of a few of our grants to make sure that we were compliant with the grants, but not the trust fund.
And then in terms of, you said the Treasury Department's pretty strict in terms of restrictions. Can you just list out, or is there a way for you to list out or get to us sort of what the requirements or restrictions are that they impose?
Well, they actually would hold the trust itself and have the agreement and the trust fund, and they basically would look at what we're procuring to make sure that it's within the guidelines of the grant. There have been times when I first started here, it was another trust fund that we had. We tried to make a procurement for the Children's Festival that was going on in the North End, and the treasurer at the time kicked it right back, saying this fund is only for police-sponsored events. You can't fund, I forget what they were looking to fund at the time at the North End's Children's Festival, and she kicked it right back. So, I mean, they are pretty stringent at making sure that we're in the guidelines of the fund.
And just so that folks who are trying to make sense of this at home, in terms of the civil asset forfeiture, it's regulated federally. Is that essentially, or is this particular asset forfeiture fund regulated federally? Are there multiple asset forfeiture funds, or is this the only one?
This one is the federal one, and then we have the state one, which is the Law Enforcement Trust Fund.
And the state one is essentially, so for instance, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, federally, that means that the federal cases, whatever seized in federal cases goes into the federal fund. State and local cases, asset forfeitures there would go into the state fund. Is that how that works?
To my understanding. Yeah.
Correct, yes.
That's my understanding of it, yes.
And so, so specifically, this purchase was made using the federal pot.
Yes.
And can we get a listing? I know that Councilor Bach asked for one for sort of asset forfeiture. I'm assuming the federal side of it. Can we get the same sort of listing of annual spending and what it's being spent on for the state city side?
Of course.
And when in terms of the funds that we're talking about, is there any noticeable difference in the size of those pots?
This pot grew considerably back 2-3 years ago as a result, and you can speak to it was related to a drug investigation.
Several joint investigations that had occurred with multiple partners. So that fund definitely grew larger than the other fund that we were just speaking of.
Substantially.
And so that, but in terms of, so that's good to know. But in terms of on in an annual year where maybe there isn't something like that happening, are two pots basically the same size, or is there always going to be a larger side on the federal side than the state side?
No, actually, to be honest with you, in the 10 years that I've been here, this trust fund has always stayed around anywhere between 180,000 and 200,000. Again, like Superintendent Cologne had said, that it was a result of a
joint investigation.
And that's what allowed us to purchase some items that we could normally not be able to purchase through our operating budget. So it helped us enhance our operating budget for purchases that we needed, or goods that we needed outside of our operating budget.
And then this is obviously, in terms of the amount, BPD and you were very clear, the money is not determined by BPD, but instead it's the ADA and the prosecution in terms of the federal money, in terms of what that amount is that goes into that fund, and that the fund has an equitable sharing trust. Is that essentially how that works?
Yes.
And so on the state side, how is that money determined?
Again, that is shared with multiple partners as well, which would be the district attorney's office, or whichever prosecutor, whichever offices are handling the prosecution. But I know we get a portion of it, as well as the district attorney's office, or the United States Attorney's office, or Attorney General's office. There may be some other partners that are involved in the investigation, and they would also get a portion of it.
And how are those portions determined? Is that by statute, or is that just up to the whim of the prosecutor?
I do not have that answer. I do not know.
And in terms of the holding of those funds, I know on the federal side that it goes into a trust. On the state side, does that go into a trust, or does BPD hold those assets?
That's held by the Treasury as well. It's under the Law Enforcement Trust Fund. The LETF is the
And so what happens in instances where that the money or whatever they've seized is actually evidence in an ongoing allegation or case? Who holds it in that case? Is it still going to a trust, or is it sent to the evidence warehouse? How does that handle?
That's a good question. I'm not sure, so I'd have to do some research and get that back to you. You're not aware.
Thank you. Thank you, and that's it. I don't want to take up too much time from the rest of them. And I appreciate, normally sometimes I'm being around trying to just get answers. I appreciate that everybody was very to the point, very, very good and thorough with their answers. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Arroyo. Those were really great questions. Really do appreciate. I'm going to have my councilors who recently joined to ask their questions and do their opening remarks when we call on you. Up next, and just so that you know who's on deck, we have Councilor Flaherty at large, Councilor Louise Jen, followed by Councilor Lydia Edwards of District 1. Then we'll have Councilor Lara, D6, Councilor Fernandez Anderson, D7, and Council President Ed Flynn, District 2. Councilor Flaherty, you now have.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director O'Brien, was this a one-time purchase, and will the department be seeking additional funding down the road from the operating budget in fiscal years to, whether it's to upgrade this technology or to acquire similar technologies?
Not that I'm aware of, Councilor, at this time. I mean, if anything comes out of the operating budget for this piece of surveillance equipment, and I would have to confirm that, would be any kind of annual maintenance service agreement that it requires, but I have not seen one come across my desk since the procurement in 2019.
Very good. And then do we know what other cities have this technology?
You don't?
I believe in Massachusetts we're the only city that has it. But most major cities, Council, most major cities across the country possess this equipment. My understanding in Massachusetts, Boston is the only municipal police department that has the equipment. Federal agencies have it.
And then as sort of part of like that, I guess, mutual aid, are we asked from time to time to share it with other neighboring departments and or cities across the Commonwealth?
We're asked to assist in the investigation, and by sharing, yes, it's with us, operating the equipment. But we have helped neighboring towns and cities.
And when you say we help, so are these human trafficking cases? Are these kidnapping cases? Are these rapes and sexual assaults, missing persons? What can you give me an idea as to, you indicate there was 106 incidents since 2017. Can you give us a snapshot of how this technology was used and how it helped with public safety?
Absolutely. So back in January, I believe 15th of 20, we were asked to assist the human trafficking unit with the human trafficking investigation. After ensuring that it fell under the parameters of a exigent circumstance, we deployed the equipment, the device. The equipment was able to locate the device, and we were able to rescue a victim. In addition to that, further investigation, it led to the recovery of rescue of two other victims of human trafficking. And that was in 20. In December 23rd, I believe, of 20, we assisted, as a matter of fact, we assisted in an investigation relative to an individual who made a threat to Mayor Walsh's life, as well as to making threats to, I believe it was to Gas City Hall. Again, we found the threat to be credible, exigent circumstances. The machine was deployed, the technology was deployed, the device, the individual who made the threats, that device was, the device of interest was located, and it was located outside the city of Boston, and the individual was located as well. And that was also handled through the courts. And I believe we also had an investigation with the, one of the more recent ones was assisting the Youth Violence Strike Force with a suicidal individual. Again, that's a person in need, immediate exigency. That device was deployed. We were able to locate that individual and get him the help that he needed. And again, that was able to locate that device, which led us to that individual, and we were able to seek him the help that was much needed.
Wow. Well, one, obviously, it's clearly paid for itself. But one incident and one life saved is well worth it. You guys had talked about the number here, the 650, and it was a collaborative effort and a sort of a multi-agency effort. Can you talk about what was it? Did we seize fentanyl? Was it a heroin bust? Was it a human trafficking bust? What was it that led to the seizure and the city getting 650 grand?
Yeah, Council, those cases were predominantly federal cases targeting drug trafficking organizations. And when I say drug trafficking organizations, those are organizations that are trafficking large amounts of drugs, fentanyl, heroin, cocaine into Boston and our surrounding communities. And that's who they target. There's no street level dealers. There's no mid-level man. These are the top guys bringing, that poison into the city.
Right. And so for those that are watching, the items that get seized are the vehicles that are used to drive, the homes that are used to stash. Can you just describe what was seized in this particular instance?
This particular incident, I don't have the exact list, but they're all predominantly vehicles, cash kept on hand, and real estate.
And then those items are sold at auction, and then the proceeds are then distributed through the various agencies, correct?
That's my understanding.
Yes, I understand it, yes.
Very good. And then as far as upgrades, so that clearly the cell site simulator is something that has worked in saving lives and keeping our city and neighboring communities in Massachusetts safe. Like all technology will need upgrades, or at some point it may come obsolete, or those that are hell-bent on, purveying poison will try to sort of outsmart the system. I guess, are we prepared to make those enhancements? And if so, will that be coming through the operating budget in future fiscal years?
So again, we're cognizant of, and I do agree, Councilor, this, technology, it turns over fast, it's quick, and units become obsolete. Yes, this is a significant purchase, but again, as I alluded to before, what it's helped us to do, save lives, we just can't put a price on that. So we do have to prepare ourselves to stay with the enhancements, the upgrades of the technology, of not trying to replace that technology. But we are cognizant of the surveillance ordinance, and we're cognizant that we're going to have to provide policies for certain technologies, and we know that any purchases will be governed by the council, and we look forward to working collaboratively with the council on these issues. and hopefully maintaining technology that saves lives.
Very good. I thank you for the work that you do, and hopefully we can continue to give you the tools, the resources, and the technology you need to keep us safe. And I want to thank, obviously, the Boston Police Department working with Council President Flynn and myself, as well as Mayor Wu's office, with identifying and removing a hate group that came to town over the weekend. So great work by your team, and look forward to working with you in the months and years ahead. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Flaherty. I am going now to Councilor Louisette. At large, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to Superintendent Colon and other members from the BPD for responses. Just a more direct question on decision-making here. Why wasn't this part of a request as part of the operating budget if it has become, as you say, such an essential part of the work?
At the time, it wasn't. The operating budget at the time was presented to City Council in the spring of 2019. I was not made aware or was asked about this purchase. I don't know if funds became available after our budget was presented, but in September of 2019 is when we started the procurement process. It wasn't intentionally left out of the budget by any shape or form. I just really think that it was a purchase that they decided the equipment that they currently have was outdated, and that we did have available funds to purchase this through the Equitable Sharing Trust Fund. So it wasn't left unintentionally. I think discussions didn't happen until August, when I first met with Lieutenant Cullity and another sergeant at the time that was looking to upgrade the existing equipment that they currently had.
Okay, and so just so that I understand the process, if something isn't part of the operating budget and it becomes a need that BPD determined, there's this process where we decide, is this something that we can use the trust to pay for?
Well, the trust is to help defray some of the costs that we might not be able to include in our operating budget, that we can supplant in our operating budget. And just as far as the operating budget process goes, it is a pretty lengthy process where we first submit what OBM likes to refer to as the maintenance budget. So what do we need to sustain just day-to-day operations? So many of the increases that you might see in our maintenance budget are those increases for maintenance service agreements, legal fees that might increase 3 to 5% every year based on inflation. Any type of new initiative, a new investment that we're asking to purchase through the operating budget gets presented to the Office of Budget Management. Questions are asked, go back and forth. What are we buying this for? We provide a lengthy description on what the purchase is, what the investment, and that's how it's presented at the time. It wasn't presented during that budget process because at the time I don't think we had a conversation about what was needed or what was needed to upgrade the existing equipment that Special Investigations had.
Okay, and you mentioned that in addition to the Southside Stimulator, there were some vans that were purchased using the trust. Do you know, are there other items that you know of that were used, where we used the trust to procure those items?
We purchased some motor vehicles to add to our existing fleet with the trust. The OBM is very generous with their lease purchase program every year, which allows us to replace the vehicles that we currently have in our fleet. We were purchasing what we call motor vehicles from auctions, and we were spending more on repairing them and servicing them because they were very old motor vehicles that our fleet director suggested that we buy new vehicles because it was under warranty and our mechanics are Ford certified, and we actually get our warranty monies back from Ford if we do the work inside and house. It just was a better frugal decision on behalf of the police department to use the trust fund at the time to purchase vehicles that were needed for various units within the department.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I look forward to, I think Councilor Bach was the one who requested sort of like a 5-year review of what's been purchased on the trust. So I look forward to reviewing that. And I have one other question, and this is just a basic question about whether you can walk us through how an asset is obtained in an investigation, how that asset turns into money. Like, for example, a car, or, what happens when a car is seized or when weapons are seized?
I think as indicated before, it goes to auction, and then the proceeds is distributed accordingly by the federal government. Federal government will distribute to the participating agencies that were in that investigation based on manpower, how much of a significant contribution they made to the investigation determines the amount of funds that are distributed to each agency that participated in the investigation, and how many hours worked on that investigation. So it appears to be a formula that they use: manpower, number of hours, and the amount of contribution from that agency or agencies will determine how that fund how those funds will be dispersed once they go to auction.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Lujan. I'm going to just keep it moving. I haven't been doing the timer, but I'm going to start timing everyone. So I want to make sure that we have time for our second panel. So, and I'm also hoping that the administration, I'm hearing some feedback, so I don't know what that, hopefully you're not hearing it, but I'm hoping the administration will be able to stay, and if not, we'll be following up with some additional things that we still want to gather here. So I'm going to go now to Councilor Edwards, District 1. You now have the floor.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that delay. I appreciate all of my colleagues' incredible questions, and I want to thank them for the specifics concerning the asset forfeiture and specifically the funding. A lot of what I had questions about is asked. So can I just, I guess, get some commitments, if you will, from the participants from the BPD? First of all, thank you again for your service and what you've been doing to help keep us safe. I just am curious if we could set up a process where maybe there's an orientation and understanding about how the annual funds that come in for forfeiture are presented. If there's ever, are you open to, or is it possible to have a community process for its actual distribution? And if any of that funding could be prioritized in healing and alternatives to 911 spaces before there's a decision to procure surveillance or any other technology.
Of course we could. I just want to point out that it's specific. Some of these purchases are specific to the Boston Police Department as far as, but it's very specific on what we can and can't use the funds for. So as long as we fall within the guidelines of the trust, absolutely, I'm open for that.
Yes.
I would really like to see how then we can design that program. I think it's a bridge building opportunity. And if the auctions and funds are there, that we're able to sit down and talk about how some of this money could be used towards healing, some, if necessary, for some re-grants, but more importantly for what we're procuring in already successful community or youth events or youth programs. So I don't know if I'll be long enough here on the city council to hold you to that, but I do appreciate the fact that you're open to it, and I do hope that you will be open to a further conversation about that community process. Councilor, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Funds can be used to support community organizations, community-based organizations, and I think I hope. Excuse me. Can.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. So then I think it would be great for us as a council and my colleagues to consider a process for that communication and that conversation to happen. I think it's a wonderful bridge building opportunity. Councilor Mejia, most of my questions that I had were already asked by the previous, my colleagues and previous hearings, but thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards, and I really do want to second and echo and ditto your comments in terms of how those dollars are used, and I absolutely was going to talk just about that, so I'm glad that you took the lead on that and trust that. I'd love to lean in on the council in regards to that, so yes. I'm going to move on to Councilor Lara from District 6. You now have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning to everyone. My apologies that I arrived a little late and will probably be having to jump off early for a previous scheduled meeting. Thank you all. I'm hoping that my questions are not repetitive because I missed probably maybe the first 30 minutes. So I hope that what I'm asking hasn't already been asked. So thank you all for being here and for your answers to our questions. Can you let me know, how do you decide when an item is seized or when an item is not? What does that decision entail?
So again, in the investigations, it's a joint investigation. So let's say if we're doing it with our federal partners or other local partners, there would be, items that would be seized would be vehicles. Again, as Sergeant Bowman alluded to earlier, real estate, and again, this is all that would be in guidance with as well. We do the initial. We would be doing the initial seizing, but again, the prosecutors are the ones that will control and handle the cases after that. But it's with guidance. We're always in contact with the prosecutors, so we would determine. Like, it would definitely be vehicles, things of value, vehicle, real estate, and I've seen some as jewelry, high-end jewelry.
So those sound like really big ticket items, but you could technically seize any property that you allege has been involved in a crime. Is that correct?
I would say, go ahead and answer that.
Councilor, I think if this answers your question, the items seized usually are proceeds of the illicit act, or items that facilitate the act, the crime. Those will be identified for seizure, and those are after review by the prosecutor. Make sure there's sufficient probable cause for that.
Okay, and so you just said that there needed to be sufficient probable cause. Does that mean that people have to be found guilty of a crime before their assets are seized?
There's different ways of it. Sometimes before they're found guilty of the crime, they can sign a waiver and waive their rights to a seizure. So it depends on the prosecution.
Can you talk a little bit about what waive their right to a seizure means?
Well, sometimes they haven't gone to trial yet on the actual criminal charges, but may waive their right to the assets that have been seized so far. And again, that's just one possibility.
So by waiving their rights, they're saying that they haven't gone to trial, but you can have the assets that have been seized.
Yeah, seize money if found or whatever.
Okay.
That's one potential option.
Okay, and there is a process for people to kind of request their assets back. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what that process looks like and if there's a cost or time associated with it?
Again, that is handled by the prosecutors, and that's a judicial process that they go in front of a judge and request those assets. But we may testify in those hearings, but that is handled by the prosecutor.
Okay, so it sounds like there is a possibility that one, you're forfeiting assets from folks with enough probable cause that there's been a crime committed, but people don't have to be found guilty of a crime. And there is what I'm assuming is a long, bureaucratic, costly process to get their belongings back. And by which that time, they could have already been sold off to auction and the benefits and the proceeds been used. And so,
No.
At least so people can request their items and they will not be sold off into auction.
Yes, if they go through the appeals process, but again, it is a lengthy process, and I have seen people receive items that have been forfeited. They've gotten them back, but it's not necessarily true that it's completely gone and they have no access to it. I have no access to it. That's not true.
Okay. but I am, based on your responses, people who have not been convicted of a crime could have their assets forfeited.
Again, on the federal side, I'll have to do some research and get you a better answer to that. I don't want to misspeak, but I know that on the state. I'm sorry?
No, so I was saying that that's perfectly fine. You don't need to have the answer at this very moment. I would love clarity on the process. And I think you might also not have the answer to this question, but do you know the dollar amount of assets that have been forfeited from people who were not convicted of a crime? And so do you follow at all when you forfeit an asset? Do you have, I'm not sure that you individually follow it, but is there a process by which you can connect that person, their case, and the outcome of their case, and whether or not the assets that were forfeited are tied to someone being criminally charged?
I'm sure that's maintained on the federal level. It's not maintained on our level because it's the federal government or the federal agency that we're participating in a particular investigation, which determines how those funds are allocated and what agencies will be allocated funds from whatever property that was seized, auctioned off, and what proceeds were received as a result of the auction. But it's a determination based on the federal government or the federal agency that we're working with at the time.
Okay. And in the hearing order, it talked about, you were talking about exigent circumstances earlier on, and in the hearing order, it said that since 2017, there's been around 41 exigent circumstances that have called for the use of this technology and have not required a warrant. Do you have a record of what those 41 exigent circumstances are, and can you send them to the City Council?
We do, and it's actually 36, and we did provide them to the City Council.
Beautiful.
It's on
Julia, I see your finger. I think that I'm done. I would like to formally request those 36 instances and clarity on the process for people to claim their assets, and if there's a dollar amount attached to people who have not been convicted of a crime whose assets have been taken by the police department.
The use of the simulator and then the amount of times it was used was provided in the council packet that was handed over to the City Council last night or yesterday afternoon. So you should already have that.
So the 36 instances in which you didn't use a warrant are outlined there.
They're outlined in the spreadsheet we provided.
They are, yes. Yes, there's 70 that was under a court order, and then there's 36 that were under exigent circumstances.
And it outlines what the exigent circumstance was.
Yes, and some information may be redacted to protect some personal information and identify information, but yes.
Understood. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair. No further questions.
Thank you, Councilor Lara. I know folks are probably, it's usually 5 minutes, but I think that my colleague had some really great questions, and I really do appreciate it. So so thank you for your grace as we allow the questions to continue to come in. I'm going to go next to Council President Ed Flynn, and I just want to note that Councilor Tanya Fernandez-Anderson had to step out, but she did provide some questions that she'd like to be read into the record and some answers to those. So I'm going to go next to Councilor President Flynn from District 2. You now have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the panel for being here and for the important work that you're doing in the city. So I have a couple of questions and just want to follow up on maybe a couple of questions that some of my colleagues asked already. With this surveillance that you have, how can you give us a couple of examples so we have a better idea of it? How has it helped? Councilor Flaherty mentioned some victims of trafficking, but can you give us a couple of examples on how it assisted them? How you use this technology to assist them? Absolutely.
As the first example that I spoke about earlier was a victim of human trafficking. This particular cell simulator was able to track a device that was attached to this victim. We were able to find and rescue this victim and provide her help, provide her services to recovery. But in addition to that, that investigation and that piece of technology that brought us to this particular victim led us to the recovery of 2 other victims who we were able to provide services to for recovery.
Could you have rescued that victim without using that technology?
I don't believe. I believe time was of the essence. I don't believe. No. Again, that is a. Is it possible? Yes. It would have been a lengthier investigation, and as you know, with human trafficking, these folks move. They move from city to city, and they don't spend too much time in certain areas. So there's a possibility of us not being able to recover that victim. So this cell site simulator, yes, it allowed us to save this individual's lives as well as 2 other individuals.
Boston, as you know, is a major international city where we have people come to this city across the world for various reasons. Do other cities in the country or throughout the world have similar technology that their police force, their public safety professionals are able to use in cases like this?
Yes, there are other cities across the nation that do have this technology. I can say that through limited research that I've done, we have guidelines and procedures that govern the way we use this technology. And as you'll see from the documentation that we provided, it's used judiciously and carefully. I can't speak to other agencies, but I can speak to this department that 106 deployments in 6 years is it shows that we do pay attention and that we do have strict policies, strict guidelines as to when we deploy this technology. But I've seen some limited through some limited research. I've seen other cities, and it's used far more than we do.
What is the procedure that is used to get approval to use this in certain situations? Can you give us like an idea of how Boston Police will get permission or use this in a lawful manner?
Yes, absolutely. Again, one of the ways that we will use it is through a court order. We're given permission through a judge to deploy the equipment to, let's say, in an instant like that would be to a joint investigation where we've had joint investigations for drug trafficking organizations where there's multiple targets, upwards to more than 20 targets. That simulator will allow us to locate the devices that are connected to those individuals who are bringing in fentanyl, who are bringing in cocaine, who are bringing in heroin that land on the streets of this city and our neighboring towns. So that would be through a court order. And in an instance of exigent circumstance, as I mentioned before, this device is under the strict control of the commander of the Special Investigations Unit. So when someone presents the Special Investigations Unit with an investigation where they believe it's exigent circumstance, the commander as well as his sergeants, they get together, they weigh the information, and they see if in fact it falls under an exigent circumstance. So it has to be, let's say, a missing person with complication. That would surely would fall under those parameters. So at that point, the commander will start to assemble the team. But much before that, we're sending out human assets. We're sending out folks to do the actual investigation. Once he makes a determination that there is an exigency, we then will contact cell phone carrier, and then we go through another round of, which is another round of security, another level of security, as well as exigency. We have to articulate what the exigent circumstance is, and if it falls within their rules and their policy, that's when we will be granted, we'll be furnished information, a unique identifiers to a device. Those are just numbers. It's not subscriber information. It's numbers to a device. That's what we use. That's what this cell site simulator uses. Once we satisfy the level of security with the cell carrier, that's when at that point we would be given those numbers, and the last location where that device registered at with the closest tower, we would go to that area. We would then deploy the device, and that device starts to capture. And then I have to stress this: it does not capture any oral communication. It doesn't capture any communication such as oral. It doesn't capture any data, and it doesn't capture any emails nor GPS. What it's capturing is identifier numbers, unique identifying numbers to a device, and that's when we'll deploy the machine, enter those numbers, and that's what it starts to. It'll emit a signal that's more attractive than the cell tower, and it will start to send signals to the simulator. Once that connectivity is established, then it'll start to hone in to the location of the device, not the GPS, the location of the device. The closer we get, the stronger the signal gets. But again, it's levels of it has to first satisfy the commander's his level of expectancy in terms of an exigent circumstance, and then after that we have to go to a second level with the cell phone carrier. So it's multiple levels of security and ensuring that there is an actual exigency occurring.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those questions, and just want to say thank you for being here. And I just also wanted to add that we worked closely with Mayor Wu and myself and Councilor Flaherty. We had a hate group in Boston over the weekend. And we're able, working with the Boston police, we're able to escort them and ask them to leave the area. But just want to highlight that, you know, we have a lot of hate groups that are in and around Greater Boston, in and around Massachusetts, but they have zero place in our city. And that's something I'm going to continue to work with city officials on. But again, want to say thank you to the Boston Police for their help over the weekend, working with myself and Councilor Flaherty and with the mayor. Thank you, Councilor Mejia.
Thank you. Thank you to all of my colleagues. This is as the chair of this hearing, this is what happens when you go last. All the best questions have already been asked and answered. So I only have a few left, and I'm gonna assert my privilege as the chair to ask those questions now. So I'm just curious, how does the Boston Police Department track returns on investments with civil asset forfeiture dollars? More specifically, like through what measures do we track whether these purchases are effective? I understand that you provided an example of the surveillance equipment in use, but what are the metrics that we're using to really track success and our return on those investments?
I don't think we actually do an ROI calculation, Madam Chair, but I think that the expectation is for us to able to defray costs that we might not have been able to have in our operating budget and allow us to do our job better, doing law enforcement, you know, our efforts. But most of the procurement of items that came out of the trust fund were basically for equipment that was needed that we did not include or would not be able to include in our operating budget for various reasons. And again, the purchases that were made over the last couple of years was a result of this this investigation, this drug investigation, because you know, normally the activity is not as great as it was the last couple of years, but it was because of the funding that was made available as a result of a drug investigation. But I can honestly say, though, that if every procurement that is made out of that fund is within Mass General Law. There's no wiggle room for any kind of circumventing the process because of all the systems and controls that are in place with the city of Boston and through the systems that we use the procurement process for. And again, we can also supply what those purchases were made the last 5 years. Plus, we do have to file an annual report with the federal government on what has come into that fund and what has gone out of that fund accordingly.
And I would add that in particular to this particular device, as you can see, I've spoke about 3 incidents. There are many more. The value of this equipment, you can't put a price on it. And we need to maintain equipment such as this because, again, if it's going to save a life, I'm with it. I'm for it, and it gets my support.
So I'm just curious, who manages the digital security of this information? Like, who's in charge at the VPD for ensuring that the data obtained through the cell-site simulator, which is not relevant to any investigation, is properly deleted?
Again, we have guidelines and procedures what governs this particular equipment. And again, we're cognizant about the surveillance ordinance policy. There are questions that arise relative to the retention of the data, and we will make a decision on that. But again, I have to reiterate, the data that we have are numbers, unique identifying numbers to a device. It's not to a subscriber, information on the subscriber. It's not personal information. It's not data. It's not oral communication. It's not GPS information. And it's just identifiers to a device.
Right. No, I understand that. And you made that point really clear. I guess my question is, can you just tell me who is responsible for deleting any data that is not relevant to a specific investigation? Like, I want to know what that looks like.
Again, we're working on the policy for that, and ultimately the decision will be made from the chief, from me, and the individual that will handle the deletion of the information would be the commander of the Special Investigations Unit.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, there is currently no policy, protocol, or procedure put in place for this.
For the deletion of the data, no.
Okay. All right. So that's definitely something. And then Lisa, just so that I'm clear, in this moment, too, there really is no real metric that we're tracking the return of our investment.
Well, I think on this investment, Superintendent Cologne talked about what the return of investment, or you couldn't put a dollar value on the return of investment based on lives that were saved. But I would say,
can you tell me how many lives?
how many lives?
And how do we make, and what is the process in terms of how we're connecting the number of lives that we save to the amount of investment? Could you be really laser focused and specific so that our viewers who are listening to really understand the point that you are trying to drive home right now?
I would have to go back and research the cases. I would say I spoke of 3 lives. Actually, in the examples I gave, probably I spoke of 5 lives. But removing a violent individual from the streets of Boston, from the city of Boston, I couldn't tell you how many lives that we saved with that, but I can tell you that we did save some lives, and we prevented some harm and trauma in our communities, which we don't need any more of. So as to give you specific numbers of lives, I would have to go back and look, but we presented 106 incidents, and there are many. There are many lives that I'm sure that we saved. There are many lives that we saved by the investigations to that human trafficking investigation, the individual involved in that. How many more lives would he have harmed down the road? He or she would have harmed down the road. So again, I can't give you specifics, but I can tell you that, yes, we've averted a lot of problems, harm, and trauma, and we've removed some violent individuals from the streets. So countless lives. That's the answer I can give you, countless lives.
And I so much appreciate your service. I guess the reason why we're stressing this particular point is because, it feels a little bit like speculation without any metrics. And in this time of data-informed policies and holding ourselves accountable, it's really important for us to have some metrics around that. But let me move on to the other questions that I have. Following up on Councilor Flaherty's question, in the last 5 years, what non-cash assets have been seized by the BPD, like cars, homes, et cetera? And do we keep a record of these assets? And could we receive a copy of that?
I'd have to, I guess we can definitely provide you a copy of that. I don't have the exact number in my head. And again, with joint investigations, this could be seized from, if we're assisting a federal partner or another state partner, they would hold those records. But yes, the assets would be seized. But I guess we could look into it and get you copies of what may have been seized. Again, as long as. Go ahead, man.
No. I thank you for that. I do appreciate. I just think it's an important point for us to just pause here real quick. Like, it would be great for you all to be in constant communication, right? And to have access to that information in real time whenever you need it. So yes, whenever you get a copy of it, please share it with us. We would really appreciate that. I guess I have, this is less of a question and more of a comment. In the spirit of transparency, I think we need to be transparent about BPD's history when it comes to the abuse of civil asset forfeiture. I only need to mention the name of John Brazil for people to know what I'm talking about. This abuse goes back decades, and without a proper accountability and transparency process, we really have no idea whether or not these civil asset dollars are being abused, right? So this is why it's so important for us to dive in and to create an opportunity for my colleagues to ask questions, and more so importantly, for the administration to come in and be more of a partner with us, so that the questions that have bubbled up to the top provide a framework and some of the things that we need to start doing a little bit more of, so that we can hold ourselves to an accountable process. So I do hope that you see that in the spirit in which we're trying to operate in, and walk away with some really great ideas in terms of things that we can do differently moving forward. I do want to just quickly, my colleague, Councilor Fernandez Anderson, wasn't able to stay, but I would like to just put her questions on the record, as well as give us an opportunity to get some answers before we move on to our next panel. And this is from Councilor Tanya Fernandez Anderson, who represents D7. Really, I'm just going to read them off, and we can just take it from there. It's like, do you get a warrant, or do you use this without a warrant? She's curious about monthly reporting every time that the device is used. Is there some sort of system or some sort of dashboard? Does the device record every time it's turned on? And how long is it turned on for? Reporting, which is very important, wants to know requiring police asking for warrants to alert the judge of any data that might be intercepted from people who are not targeted of their surveillance. She'd like to know that they would also have to tell the judge about any possible uses and setting in which First Amendment rights are being exercised, exceptions to getting the warrant. Curious about law enforcement would also be allowed to use them in emergency situations with the potential for loss of life, but in a warrant would need to be obtained within 48 hours of use. As you know, the data would need to be deleted. I guess the last piece, and maybe this is a comment or a question, is law enforcement could use stingrays in order to prevent the detonation of a bomb from a mobile device, since they can be blocked incoming calls on this device. That's just more of a comment. So I know I said a lot there, guys. Lean into the questions that you want to address, or that you need to address as posed as questions. And I can help you if you need some clarity. So I guess We'll I'll just start from a question specifically. Does the device record every time it's turned on? And if so, how long is it turned on for? Just answer that one, and then I'll just go through the rest.
Yes, there is a record of every time it's turned on and the duration it's on. It stays on as long as we need to find the device we are looking for.
Got it. Do you get a warrant or no use, or use it without a warrant?
Again, there are instances where we use it with a warrant. It will have a warrant, and then there are exigent circumstances, such as the trying to locate a missing person with complications, trying to locate individuals, suicidal folks that might have that are in need of services, kidnapping victims. So yeah, there are exigent circumstances that we'll use it for. So it's with the warrant and exigent circumstances.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I guess in regards to the warrant, I guess the question around this piece is, if you have to obtain a warrant within 48 hours of use, would you then delete the data once, the information that you found no longer is relevant? Like, there's this question is continuing to come up around the deletion of the data.
So again, the data, we need to be clear for the council's sake, is that the data that is retained, it's unique identifiers to a device. It is not any type of communication, any type of oral communication, any type of text, email, GPS, none of that. It's just data to a device. It's numeric numbers to a particular device. So just so she's clear on that.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And then the last is in terms of training. We're curious about whether or not there is any training around privacy and civil liberties for those folks who are interfacing with this equipment.
Can you repeat the question again? I'm
Can
sorry.
you just repeat the question?
Yeah, and my internet is unstable, y'all, so sorry about that. So the question is really about training and whether or not there's training available to those folks who are interfacing with the equipment around privacy and civil liberties.
Yes, these officers, and again, there's only a select number of officers who will operate this equipment, this technology, and they're well-versed in the Fourth Amendment, they're well-versed in the Constitution. So yes, there's training.
All right, and this is not a question from my colleague, this is a question from me as the chair. Can you tell me a little bit about how many folks make up the small cohort of people? What are the qualifications?
How many folks make up the cohort on the Special Investigations Unit? There are 14 individuals, 1 commander, 2 supervisors, 10 detectives, and I believe 1 police officer.
Awesome. How many of them are women?
And, Trish, 15, I'm sorry, 15. And yes, we have, currently, right now, we have 1 female officer in that unit.
1 female officer, okay.
Yes.
And how many of them are people of color?
In that unit?
Mm-hmm.
Answer that. One second, ma'am, I'm just. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
5. And what does it take to get into that unit?
So years of experience in investigations. There's many qualifications. The ability to work well with others. But again, there's many qualifications. It's individuals who are inspired and motivated and well-connected in the community. So as I'm speaking, I'm looking, offices are popping in my head, and these are officers that have worked in communities such as District 3, District 2, as you know, is Mattapan, Roxbury, and who are still connected, very much connected in those districts.
And what type of, again, these, I just wanted to state for the record that these are my questions. I'll be done with Councilor Fernandez and questions. I'm just curious in terms of like, has there been in your experience and time, any folks utilizing this equipment in ways that are, would not be in terms of the way it was deemed to initially? Like, has there been any times that the department has realized that there's been some abuse in terms of the way this equipment was supposed to be intended to be used?
Absolutely not. As you can see, we keep strict documents as to when this equipment is deployed, and no, none that I know of.
Okay.
No.
But you have record of that, but you don't have record of the return on the investment or any procedures in terms of how documents are going to go through. I just think that it's really important for us to look at the whole picture around accountability and transparency, because I think that that's what's going to help us move this conversation forward. And I'm not going to hold folks any longer than what they need to, but I will thank my colleagues for the questions. And I know we have a second panel up next. And I would say this is that I would strongly urge the administration to stick around and listen to what our second panel has to say. And I will now turn it over to our second panel, starting with Fatima Ahmed from the Executive Director of the Muslim Justice League, to give her remarks, no more than 5 minutes. And again, thank you to my colleagues for your round of questions in round one, and really do appreciate the administration for joining us this morning. Fatima, you now have the floor.
Yes, thank you. So excited to be part of this first hearing for this committee and to talk about this really important issue. I want to be clear, particularly for counselors and for the public watching, that we're really talking about 3 significant issues here. So I'm going to try to break those down, and then Cade, my colleague, is going to be talking about one of them in depth. When I say that there are 3 different issues, one, we're talking about civil asset forfeiture. That in and of itself, has a lot of concerns, and I think a few counselors have already, alluded to that. Second, there is the fact that BPD is bypassing the city council in terms of purchasing anything, not just surveillance equipment, using these funds. And then third, there's the actual surveillance that's happening using the stingrays or other equipment. So I'm going to talk a good bit about the first 2 issues, but they're all deeply important and all deserve, a good deal of investigation and research and oversight. So in terms of civil asset forfeiture, I want to be clear that, according to a number of sources, Massachusetts is the worst state in terms of civil asset forfeiture law. That is according to the Institute for Justice, which does a lot of work on this. That's a direct quote from them, that we're the worst state on this. And WBUR did an investigation on this recently as well, and also indicated that Massachusetts has the lowest legal bar for civil asset forfeiture. And while other states and even the Supreme Court have, raised the bar for this recently, Massachusetts has not moved on this. And so we as Boston, one, should be worried and embarrassed that Massachusetts is the worst state in terms of this when other folks have been, seeing the issues with this. And we as a city at least need to raise the bar beyond probable cause for civil asset forfeiture. While, BPD, I think, just shared a few examples where they've, used this equipment to save lives, supposedly. I also want to be clear that, the majority of cases that they sent over in their documents are drug investigations. And when we look at civil asset forfeiture, a lot of that also tends to be around drug investigations. And again, according to WBUR and their investigations around this, these things tend to, as we know, impact people of color and folks who are low income. And yes, as many people have been asking and I think questioning here, assets can be seized from people who have not been convicted of a crime. They can be held indefinitely, even if charges were dismissed. And the difficulty of for the process of getting your assets back is extremely difficult. So a lot of folks are already looking into this, and I really hope that the council looks further into just the process of civil asset forfeiture. What we're talking about with civil asset forfeiture and with the stingrays is both around the Fourth Amendment, right? It's our right against unreasonable search and seizure. So when we say civil asset forfeiture, we're talking about potentially unreasonable seizure of assets. We're also talking about with the surveillance, unwarranted, literally unwarranted, as they've indicated, examples of surveillance. I think the one other thing I will say about civil asset forfeiture is, and hopefully this is obvious to folks, but I want to make sure it's really clear and obvious, to have law enforcement be capable of seizing assets, and then they are the ones who get to spend those assets, and they are the ones who are deciding how that is quote unquote equitably distributed between 3 different law enforcement agencies. That is rife for abuse. As Councilor Mejia said, we've seen this kind of abuse already. And I think there is a lot more that could be uncovered there, and people should be concerned about the fact that it is law enforcement seizing the assets and then law enforcement spending those assets. The second part that I will dig into a little bit is the fact that BPD is bypassing city council procedures, city council oversight over our budget, over our finances, over our spending. And I think Councilor Bach spoke to this a little bit. I think both in terms of surveillance, right? There's the issue of them using surveillance equipment or buying surveillance equipment specifically without people knowing. And we know that this has happened a number of times. We're not talking about the first time, right? I think, hopefully folks remember BPD buying and using drones that were visibly seen in the city. We all know about them using social media surveillance equipment called geophilia, and then getting a lot of pushback when people realize this. That's part of why for many years now, folks have pushed for surveillance oversight specifically. So I'm glad that ordinance is going to provide a little bit of oversight just over surveillance technology. And likely we're going to see a lot come out of that, later this summer when they're required to report on that. There are other ways I believe that BPD is able to spend money that's not actually visible to the city council. I don't know for sure because I'm not an expert in this and I don't want to be an expert, but I hope that you all look into this because, aside from civil asset forfeiture, there are nonprofits that exist like the Boston Police Foundation, which claim that they are donating not only money, but specific equipment and surveillance tech specifically to the Boston Police Department. The Boston Police Foundation, according to news reports, they're the ones who bought the $89,000 ice cream truck for BPD that many folks know about. They also, according to their website, have bought surveillance tech at least $117,000 worth, including 2 license plate readers, and they have put money towards ShotSpotter and bullet tracks. That's just what I know from their website. I have not seen those kinds of purchases going through, city council oversight, the budget process. And so I really hope that following this hearing that you all can ask some of those questions about also how is, not just civil asset forfeiture funding used, but how are these nonprofit donations happening? Where, if any, oversight is there? How can we actually make sure that there is oversight of that? Because it is really worrisome that an external source could just be buying surveillance tech and other things, plenty of other things that they buy, like the ice cream truck, but surveillance tech in particular for BPD without oversight. So again, I think those two issues, civil asset forfeiture and bypassing city council, are both really important, and equally as important is just surveillance and these stingrays and how we're using those. Thank you.
Thanks, Fatima. So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Councilor Mejia, for calling this really important hearing. My name is Cade Crockford. I run the Tech for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. I just want to say one more thing about asset forfeiture, which is that to directly answer Councilor Lara's question, yes, the police can and do seize property in Massachusetts from people not convicted of any crime. As Fatima said, we have the worst asset forfeiture law in the country, and the legislature, however, is working on this issue. So Senate Bill 2671 is legislation that's currently before the state Senate, which would reform asset forfeiture procedures in Massachusetts and address a lot of these problems with the current law. So we hope the legislature will bring that bill to the floor and approve it this session. And anything you councilors can do to help make that happen would be really fantastic. So getting to the stingray, in its letter to the council prior to this hearing, the Boston Police Department maintained that there is no secrecy problem with respect to its stingray acquisition or use. So I just want to take a step back and contextualize today's conversation with a little bit of history. Back in 2015, the BPD told a number of people who submitted records requests about stingrays that it could not produce any records regarding stingray technology. And here's what the department said, quote, "The information you've requested is exempt from disclosure by state public records law. Disclosure of the information contained in these documents would not be in the public interest and would prejudice the possibility of effective law enforcement. More specifically, the protection of such investigatory materials and reports is essential to ensure that the department can continue to effectively monitor and control criminal activity and thus protect the safety of private citizens." So after fighting the request, the department finally turned over one document to these requesters. And what was that? It was a non-disclosure agreement that the Boston Police Department had signed with the FBI. This is a very interesting and important document. It says the Boston Police Department will coordinate with the FBI about public records requests related to stingray equipment. It also says that the Boston Police Department should drop criminal cases instead of hand over information to defense attorneys about the use of stingrays in criminal investigations. So this document was signed by former Boston Police Commissioner Ed Davis in 2013. It's available online. I can send it to anyone who's interested in seeing it. That's a lot of secrecy. Later on, after the cat was well out of the bag on the Boston Police Department's use of stingrays, not due to the department's transparency, mind you, but due to persistent efforts by people outside the department to uncover information about its use, my office, the ACLU of Massachusetts, filed a records request with the Boston Police Department to learn about how it was using its stingray. This, mind you, was after police officials assured the public that the device was only used subject to a warrant or in emergencies. Well, that turned out not to be true. The documents that we got from the Boston Police Department showed that, in fact, they had never once obtained a warrant to use this device. This was in 2016. Now, the decision about whether to or not to obtain a warrant is no longer a policy choice at the Boston Police Department. I just want to be really clear about that. In 2019, the Supreme Judicial Court, in a case called Commonwealth v. Almanor, ruled that the police must obtain a warrant in order to use this device. So it is no longer a choice. In exigent circumstances, they don't have to get a warrant, but the SJC has said that in investigations they do. So now let's focus on, so anyway, you know, that provides a different perspective, I think, on the question of secrecy surrounding this technology. We now learn that BPD has spent $627,000 of asset forfeiture funds buying new cell site simulator equipment and claims that it did so transparently, but there's absolutely nothing transparent about how this has gone down. The BPD knows this is controversial technology. It has been the subject of media reporting, civil rights organization investigations and criticism. and numerous public records requests for nearly a decade. Despite this, and despite the fact that the city council was deliberating over an ordinance that would require the police to bring surveillance technologies like this before them for approval, at the very time that the department was procuring it, the department did not notify the council, nor did it provide any documentation to the council or the public about how the technology would be used, including by providing a policy, which I just want to say still has not happened. So I want to be clear, we would not be here. We would not know about the Boston Police Department's use of forfeiture funds to buy this technology if it weren't for the hard work of investigative reporters. Now that Shannon Dooling, namely at WBUR, has published information about the BPD's purchase of this technology, and now thanks to the council, your leadership, Chair Mejia, that you've called this hearing, the Boston Police Department has produced some basic information about the use of the stingrays, but there's a lot that we still don't know. So first, what are the capabilities of this device? The documentation provided by the police indicates the technology can not only scan and track cell phones, but also Wi-Fi connected devices, potentially like laptops. Does it include smart devices, any technology with a MAC address? If so, has BPD used this technology to track devices other than cell phones? We don't know. Also, is the device capable of intercepting communications or merely tracking the locations of phones? Wiretap law in Massachusetts is extremely strict, and it would therefore be very troubling if the Boston Police Department possessed a device capable of enabling it to directly perform wiretapping. One of the officers who spoke today did say that the Boston Police does not collect this information using its stingrays, but it did not say whether the device is capable of collecting that information. And clarity on that question is essential. Second, while the SJC has required the police to obtain warrants to use stingrays in criminal cases, it's not clear that the police are always clear with courts about the specific surveillance technology they will use to execute a warrant that they've applied for. And basically the way to explain that is the police can go to a judge and say, Your Honor, we'd like a warrant to track this person's cell phone. The judge may not know that the police intend to use a stingray to effectuate that warrant. And that matters because judges can implement all sorts of, kind of enhanced protections to ensure that, for example, information collected about people who are not subjected to the warrant is deleted. But if the court doesn't know that the police intend to use a stingray to effectuate a warrant, they can't impose those kind of minimization requirements as a condition of granting the search warrant. The simplest way to clear this up would be for the Boston Police Department to provide not only a spreadsheet of information showing when the stingray was used, but the actual warrant applications that it filed with the court in each of those cases to the council and to the public. And so a related question there is whether the BPD provides information about the use of stingrays to criminal defendants in the discovery process. And if so, what kind of information is provided? Third, does the BPD have a policy to govern the use of this technology? It seems like no. One of the officers who spoke today said that they have guidelines and procedures, but none of those have been produced. If they exist, they were not provided in the materials forwarded to the council in advance of this meeting. And if they do not exist, that is extremely troubling. Stingrays can capture information about hundreds or even thousands of people, even when they're just looking for one cell phone. And if the Boston Police Department is collecting, even incidentally, information about people not subject to a search warrant or an emergency, we need to know what it does with that information. Does it have policies and procedures in place to govern how that data is maintained, deleted, shared, et cetera? Are these data provided to prosecutors or to criminal defendants subject to discovery requests? And finally, during today's hearing, one of the officers mentioned that the people who operate this device are trained, and yet, again, we saw no training materials in the materials that were forwarded to the council. Are there documents related to that training that could be provided to the council and the public? If so, I think we should see them. So these are just some of the remaining outstanding questions that are unanswered by the documents provided by BPD. A couple final notes. One is that when police and intelligence agencies justify extreme privacy invasions like the use of stingrays, we are always told, including at today's hearing, that these technologies are necessary due to extreme circumstances, life-threatening events like terrorism, murder investigations, and kidnapping. And yet, like clockwork, when information is produced to show how these technologies are actually used, the vast majority of deployments involve routine drug investigations. And that is exactly what we see here. You know, it is true, the Boston Police Department did use this technology a handful of times over the years to find missing persons and kidnapped people, but the vast majority of the deployments were essentially routine drug investigations in the war on drugs. So I'll wrap up by simply saying that the police department seems to misunderstand the requirements of the surveillance ordinance enacted by the council earlier this year. In the letter the Boston Police Department sent to the council in advance of this hearing, the department says that any future surveillance purchases will be subject to council approval and control, but that is not the whole story. The ordinance indeed requires that not only future purchases, but also all existing technologies and the policies governing their use be approved by the council. So I just want to make sure that everybody on the council understands that and that the Boston Police Department understands that. And thank you again, Councilor Mejia, for calling this hearing and for taking the time to listen to us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much to you both for bringing a little bit of clarity and a little bit of insight and perspective to all of the things that are at play. And I think that, you know, as we continue to navigate through this committee that we have just created, I think we definitely want to like switch things up in terms of how we run some of our hearings. So we're going to be leaning in because it would be great to have a little bit of back and forth and allow BPD to kind of like clarify some of these things that we have just heard. So, but since they're no longer here, we can't do a deeper dive into those things, but I really do appreciate. I think that in the interest of being super mindful of everybody's time, I'd like to be able to kick it over to my colleagues for questions. I'm going to go first to my co-sponsor, Councilor Arroyo, followed by Councilor Louis-Jean, and then wrapping up with Councilor Edwards, and then to me for some final questions. Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I actually don't have any questions for this panel. I just have a profound appreciation and gratitude for the thoroughness and the details and the things that we should be following up at and looking at closer. Thank you so much to this panel for the work that you've been doing and what you presented today.
Thanks, Councilor.
I concur. I do believe that they killed it. Okay, Councilor Louis-Jean, you now have the floor.
Sorry about that. I just want to say thank you again to Fatima and to Cade for being here, for the light that you've shown on the entire process. Only one question, Cade. How would this work? How would this process work under the past surveillance ordinance? Like, how was it supposed to look like? You know, especially as a new city councilor, but the ordinance is new. What is it supposed to look like?
Great question. So the police department has some time to comply with the ordinance. They have, I forget exactly what the date is, but I think probably
a year's time,
a year or something like that, to essentially put together a list of all the surveillance technologies that are covered by the ordinance, and then provide documentation about those technologies to the city council and to the public. The council then has an opportunity to ask for more information about those technologies, to ask for specific policies to govern the use of individual technologies like this one that pose particular privacy risks, and then to solicit comments from the public about each of these individual technologies. And then the council has an opportunity to decide whether or not the city should continue using these technologies. The council can also, for example, say, well, we recognize that the Stingray, for example, is valuable in terms of locating missing persons, people who are kidnapped, things like that. But we have some real concerns about the lack of information that has been provided about policies and procedures with respect to how the data is, what kinds of data are collected by these technologies, how that data is maintained, whether that information is shared with defense counsel and courts and things like that, and can request that the Boston Police Department provide more information before saying, okay, we're going to approve its use, subject to these kinds of policy protections. So that's the way that the ordinance is meant to work. Or, the council could say, we don't think this technology is appropriate at all, and, we deny its use.
Thank you, Cade. Really appreciate your expertise here. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Louisiana. Is that it for questions?
That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, I'll go next to Councilor Edwards. Councilor Edwards, just wanted to let you know you now have the floor should you choose to accept the invitation to come in for questions. Okay. I think in this, I'll just move, I don't think any of my other colleagues are here. So first, I want to thank you both for not only showing up, but for continuing to hold all of us accountable to the work, to ensuring that transparency and openness with all things public safety. And I would also like to just ask a few questions to our famous, and I was going to say dope advocates, but whatever, you guys are dope. These are the questions for you both. I think we need to be moving into a conversation around reparative justice when it comes to civil asset forfeiture. And I'm wondering if either of you could expand on what we can do as a city to increase accountability towards these reckless civil asset forfeitures.
Yeah, I can start. I think, you know, someone may have asked about this or hinted at it, the idea of using, it may have been Councilor Edwards actually, the idea of using these funds to go towards community groups or other, you know, other locations besides just funding law enforcement. And while that's an option, you know, I would encourage the city council to actually think about how can we limit civil asset forfeitures first, right? Why are we actually seizing, you know, these items and this money from people to begin with, particularly when we're looking at drug investigations? I think it's the same person who uncovered this has also covered civil asset forfeiture, you know, broadly in Massachusetts. And so I think actually talking to Shannon Dooling and making sure that you all are looking into, you know, what she has uncovered and how this is actually happening. Hopefully, as Cade said, if we get this bill passed, you know, statewide and that lifts, you know, lifts the requirements, that will be helpful. But if it doesn't happen, then we need to think about what we can actually do as a city to potentially, you know, increase the requirements for BPD. So I think the main question there is around probable cause versus I can't remember the other term for it, but you can increase the legal bar so that it's not just, you know, based on suspicion that somebody may have done something, but raising the bar to say you have to be pretty damn sure that they did something, right, before you take these things from them.
Yeah, I would only add, thanks, Fatima. I would only add, it's preponderance of the evidence is the standard that the state law, the state bill 2671 in the Senate would apply, which is a higher bar than probable cause. So yeah, I would only add that, you know, anything that you can do as counselors to advocate for the passage of that bill this session, I think would be probably the most important thing that you could do. So I don't know if there's a resolution, you know, or any other, you know, action, maybe a letter from the council to the Boston delegation. You know, there's a particularly powerful person who represents Boston at the State House who might benefit from hearing from the council.
Thank you for that prompt. We heard that message loud and clear. So for those who are listening in, colleagues, we have some marching orders. The other piece that I just kind of wanted to, I'm just curious about, and I wish this question with the administration still here would have been really extremely helpful. But, you know, there is this perceived notion and that everybody knows what their rights are. And there's a privilege when folks believe that people have access to information or not. And I'm just curious from, you know, an advocacy standpoint, what information in terms of just even signage? I don't know, I just feel like that might defeat the purpose because they're trying to gather information on the down low. But I just feel like there needs to be some sort of disclosure. I mean, is that something that you guys have talked about or considered or advocating for? I'm just curious.
I mean, I would just say that, that's one of the reasons why we fought for so long for the surveillance ordinance is because this kind of thing should not be happening in secret. And, the claims that the police have made, for a decade plus about why it's important to keep information secret about stingray surveillance, I think are pretty ridiculous, frankly. The notion that people think that the government can't track cell phones. I think even in 2013, that was pretty silly. So I would just say that public education is an important thing for advocacy organizations like ours to be engaged in, for the council to be engaged in, and I think the press plays a role there too. So I don't know that signage is necessarily the direction that we would want to go in, but certainly, when we're having conversations with folks in the community about policing and surveillance, letting people know that this is something that's out there, I think is important.
Yeah, I will add that, I think that comes up sometimes where folks think that if we do more know your rights trainings and people know that these cameras exist or know more, including the surveillance ordinance, right? Just knowing that they have this equipment, that's enough. And it's really not. We see quite literally every day that people's rights are violated, even if they know about it. There's very little you can do, especially when we're talking about law enforcement, right? The amount of power that they have over you, especially in moments like this, where maybe they are barging into your home and seizing, items from your home and arresting you. We can't expect people to be able to push back on that in the moment. And I think same with surveillance equipment, just knowing that we have it doesn't mean that, the whole community is going to be able to come to a hearing on a Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. to let you all know that they don't want these stingrays in the community. So we really need elected officials to actually set a higher bar. Transparency, just knowing that things exist is like the bare minimum, but we actually need to look at banning things, right? Restricting them, raising the legal bar.
Thank you for that. So I just wanted to just quickly acknowledge, I'm not sure if any of my other colleagues have a second round of questions, and just to thank my colleagues for their questions. And I'm gonna ask central staff to see if you all have anyone waiting for public testimony. And I would have to, before we move on to public testimony, I wanted to just quickly acknowledge that level of accountability is really key. And I'm glad that you both are pushing the council to recognize our power around the accountability piece, because one thing is to know what we know, and that transparency is great, but the other piece is like how we're going to move beyond that conversation, and putting a ban to some of the things that we are talking about here today, and other stuff that needs to be delved into deeper. So thank you for that, and really do appreciate it. I believe it looks like we have a Carlos Pacheco in the audience, but I don't see them registered to give testimony. So Carlos, if you're here to provide testimony, can you please come forward and state whether you're here for public testimony? All right. Carlos going once, going twice. All right, we're gonna keep on moving then. Anyone else? I seeing none. I would just like to thank everyone for attending this hearing. My colleagues brought in some really great questions, and so I really do appreciate how prepared we were to really dive into this, and also the administration for participating. Oftentimes we host these events, these hearings, and the administration does not show up. And so to have them show up, we do appreciate it. I guess for me, the next round of requests would be to show up and stay. I think that that would be extremely helpful, especially so that there could be some dialogue between the advocates and folks in the administration, because there was a lot that was brought forth in the second panel that I think would have really helped shape the conversation. So hopefully you'll take a time to tune in and listen, because there's always an opportunity to learn. Our office will also follow up to obtain the following information that was following up on information that was brought up through the counselor's questions. Just kind of wanted to just do a little, just for the record, some of the things that we're going to be following up on. The 1997 agreement and the federal equitable sharing agreement mentioned during Counselor Bach's questioning. We're gonna follow up on information regarding the federal database on civil asset forfeiture. We're gonna ask for a breakdown of the civil asset forfeiture dollars obtained from individuals with convictions versus non-convictions. We're gonna ask and request a breakdown of the exigent circumstances and a log of every time the cell site simulator has been turned on as recommended by CADE. And that's all, but not for now. That's just for now. I'm calling this hearing to a close. Thank you so very much, everyone who has participated. Gaveled us out. Thank you so much. Bye.